Hello and welcome back to our Bible study, and the subject is the pursuit of wisdom. Now this is our third session, and so far we have defined wisdom. We have talked about sources of wisdom, and we've talked about the foundation or the beginning of wisdom. Now insofar as what wisdom is, wisdom is more than intelligence. It's more than ability. It's more than the ability to apply knowledge to achieve a desired end. And the reason we know that wisdom is more than intelligence or more than ability to apply knowledge is because the Bible tells us that there are different kinds of wisdom, different sources of wisdom. There is a wisdom from above, from God, and there is a wisdom from this world system. And they produce different results. The Bible tells us that this wisdom of the world system is superficial. It's shallow. That is, it has the appearance of wisdom, but the end result is destructive rather than constructive. It's harmful rather than helpful. It's malevolent rather than benevolent. It's cruel rather than kind. It bears a different fruit, or it results in different consequences. And by this world, or this world system, we're talking, of course, about a philosophy, a way of thinking. It's a philosophy that says there's no place for God in our thinking. We will determine our own value systems, our own principles, our own way of life, our own laws, our way of thinking without reference to God. And there is a wisdom that comes out of that thinking. But again, it's a superficial wisdom, and the results of that wisdom should be evident. Destruction, pain, suffering, disharmony, unrest, what we see in the news day after day after day. It's the result of humanity, of people not putting God first in our lives. Simply put, that's what it comes down to. And the scripture tells us that there's also wisdom from God, and tells that it is pure, it's peaceable, it's gentle, it's full of mercy, and it bears good fruits. That is, it is constructive rather than destructive. It's helpful rather than harmful. It's benevolent rather than malevolent. It's good rather than evil. And there's no doubt that people who embrace the wisdom of this world system may think that what they consider to be wisdom to actually be wisdom. And what I mean by that is there are no doubt people who think that destruction is an indication of wisdom insofar as it helps me get what I want. In other words, it's based on selfishness or self-interest. True wisdom is not based on selfishness or self-interest. True wisdom is the result of love, of caring about other people. And so true wisdom, by its very nature, is benevolent rather than malevolent. It's productive rather than destructive. It's helpful rather than harmful. And so now, then we talked about the source of wisdom or the pursuit of wisdom, and we began with the foundation of wisdom, which is the fear of God, the respect for God, which is the opposite of the philosophy of the world system. The fear of God is the realization that God cannot be ignored, that God must be taken serious, that we establish our value systems, our way of thinking, our way of life in reference to the Lord. And so let's continue today, and today we're going to talk about wisdom and humility. I mentioned before that we're going to talk about this subject in 5 areas: wisdom and the fear of God, wisdom and humility, wisdom and affections, wisdom, correction, and discipline, and wisdom and purpose. Now, what we mean by that is we're talking again about the pursuit of wisdom. And the point is that if we're going to pursue wisdom, we need to embrace the fear of God. If we're going to pursue wisdom, we need to embrace humility. And the scriptural reference that we will use right in the beginning is Proverbs 11:2, which says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. So what we need to do today is we want to define humility, make sure we understand what we're talking about. We want to talk about humility in relation to God, and humility in relation to other people. So when we think about defining humility, if you look in dictionaries, you'll find statements such as humility is lowliness of mind. Now, that may or may not be clear to us. What exactly is lowliness of mind? Sometimes I think we have the opinion that a humble person thinks that they're worthless, or a humble person thinks they have nothing to contribute. That's not humility. That could be the result of ignorance. It could be a false form of humility, but it isn't humility. The essence of humility, I think this will help us understand something. If you'll bear with me, I believe I can prove what I'm going to say. That the essence of humility is the recognition, the acknowledgement, and the acceptance of truth. Now, why do I say that? Well, because as we just learned from this scripture in Proverbs, the opposite of humility is pride. With pride comes disgrace, with humility comes wisdom. So in this passage, they are presented as diametrically opposed to one another. And sometimes the best way to understand something, or at least a very helpful way to understand something, is to consider its direct opposite. And we are probably better at defining pride than we are humility. And hopefully when we're finished today, we'll be equally able to define and understand what humility is. So let's begin by talking about pride. The root meaning is high-minded, the opposite of low-minded, but still that doesn't necessarily help. The Hebrew and Greek words that are translated pride in the Bible speak of being lifted up. So a person can lift himself up mentally, exalted. We may think of pride, someone who's blinded by conceit. They have let me just read this definition from the McClintock and Strong Encyclopedia. Pride is an inordinate and unreasonable self-esteem. It's attended with insolence and rude treatment of others. Pride manifests itself by praising ourselves, adoring our persons, attempting to appear before others in a superior light to what we are. It's contempt and slander of others, envy at the excellencies others possess, anxiety to gain applause, distress and rage when slighted, impatience of contradiction, and opposition to God himself. Now, obviously, then humility is the opposite of this description. So let's define some of our terms a little better. What is arrogance? Arrogance is defined, and these definitions come from the Oxford English Dictionary, unless I say otherwise. Arrogance is the taking of too much upon oneself as one's right. Undue or unwarranted assumption of dignity or authority or knowledge. So an arrogant person would, their persona would be such that they have more authority than they actually do, or that they know more than they actually know. And insolence is defined as offensive contemptuousness of action or speech due to presumption. It's contempt for those considered inferior. Contempt is the mental attitude in which a thing or a person is considered of little value, as having no value or worth. Now, all of us are probably aware of the charge of contempt of court, in which a judge may say to a defendant or an attorney, if you say that again or you do that again, you will be held in contempt of court. Now, what they mean by that is that the person is exhibiting the belief that the court holds no value, that it's worthless. That's what taking place has no value. So it's contempt for the court. And so insolence is this contempt for other people. The belief that other people don't have the same value, for example, that I might think I have. Rude is unmannerly, uncivil, impolite, offensively, or deliberately discourteous. I've heard it said that good manners are the way we let people know we respect them. The opposite of respect, of course, is contempt. And so understanding what pride is, if we can just think of the opposite of all of these definitions, this gives us the understanding of humility. Now, I want to bring this out more fully by saying that the essence of humility is the recognition, acknowledgement, and acceptance of truth. And so let me briefly say this. If pride is an exaggerated opinion of one's self-importance, what does the word that exaggerated imply? It implies something that's not true. High-mindedness or pride is believing something that isn't true. It's truth that is stretched to a point where it's no longer true. That's what an exaggeration is. And that's what pride is. It's an element of truth that is exaggerated to a point where it's no longer true. That's why I say that humility, the essence of humility, is the recognition and acknowledgement and acceptance of truth. Now, let me talk about some more scriptures and points to help us understand. Let's begin by talking about humility in relation to God. Not long ago, I was in a shop, in a store. I saw a young man with a t-shirt, and I have the habit of liking to read what people have on their shirts, sometime on the back or the front of their shirt. And this particular message on the front of this young man's shirt was, "Nothing is impossible." And when I read that, it reminded me of other statements that I've heard in the last few years. Our society has developed, I think, a good way of thinking, in that we want our children to grow up with a positive self-esteem. And that's a good thing, that's a helpful thing. But again, if we exaggerate that, we take it to a point that it's no longer a good thing or a positive thing. Now, what am I talking about? One of the things that I've heard motivational speakers say, or I've heard people just in general say when they're, for example, speaking at a graduation ceremony, they might say, "You can do anything you set your mind to. You can do anything if you're willing to work hard enough, if you're willing to make enough sacrifice, if you're willing to apply yourself." I've heard successful actors say this. You can do anything. And of course, the purpose behind that is to help build a sense of a positive self-esteem in young people. And again, that's a good thing. But what if it's taken to a point of exaggeration? What then? Is it still a helpful thing? Let's consider something. The question we want to ask ourselves is, are these statements true? Are they true? And we're talking about humility right now in relation to God. Is it true that for humans nothing is impossible? Is it true that humans can accomplish anything they want to, that we want to, if we're willing to work hard enough, if we're willing to apply ourselves and sacrifice enough? The question is that true? Now, the Bible, there's a passage in the Bible that talks about things that are of the world, and there are three things that are specifically mentioned in this passage. The cravings of physical pleasure, if you will, the lust of the eyes, the greedy longings of the mind, our imagination that's stimulated by what we see, and what the Bible calls the pride of life. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. Now, what is the pride of life? What does that mean? Well, the pride of life, frankly, is the belief that we humans can accomplish anything, given enough time and enough education and enough resources. In other words, we don't need God. The pride of life is humanism. It's a humanistic philosophy that says reason is more important to solving human problems than God, than faith. So that's the pride of life. It's this lofty sense of self-sufficiency. And so, returning to these questions again, is it true that we can accomplish anything given enough time and enough education, enough effort? Is it true that for humans nothing is impossible? I was listening to a successful man, a television host of his own TV program, and he was talking about this very subject. And he was remembering that when he was a young boy, he told his father that his dream was to be on television. He wanted to be a TV personality. And he said that his father continually told him he could never do it. You can never be that. You might as well set your sights lower because you'll never be able to achieve that. Perhaps because of his race, because of his limited education, whatever, his dad said, you'll never do it. Now, he referred to his dad as a dream killer. And I would hate for my children to define me as a dream killer. Now, I personally don't believe that for humans nothing is impossible. Obviously, for God nothing is impossible. But I don't believe that for humans. I also don't believe that humans can do anything we want to do if we're willing to work hard enough or if we have enough education. So does that mean I'm a dream killer? Well, let me assure you that when my children were younger, when they were little and they talked about what they wanted to be when they grew up, I certainly wanted to do everything I could to encourage them. I didn't want to discourage them and say, you can't do it. I would often say things like, well, other people do it, so why can't you do it? And I would try to encourage them, and I would always want to do that. And I would always encourage parents to encourage their children rather than kill their dreams, as this man said. But that still doesn't answer the question. Are these statements true that a person can do anything? And in order to answer that question, we need to define some terms. We need to define the terms finite and infinite. Finite and infinite. Finite, the dictionary definition of finite is having a definite limit or fixed size. Something that's finite can be measured. I have a friend who's an engineer, and he was fond of saying, to measure is to know. He said that was the engineer's motto, if you will. To measure is to know. So anything that can be measured is finite. It has limits. It's so high, so wide, so deep, so heavy, so fast, so slow, whatever. It has limits. Infinite is without limits. Something that's infinite is without end, and it is impossible to measure. It's not impossible to measure because it's so big. It's impossible to measure because it is without limits. It isn't so heavy or so fast or so slow. It has no limits. Therefore, it cannot be measured. And so the question we want to ask now is, are humans finite or infinite? What's the answer to that question? Do we humans have limitations? Now, I know that people might say, well, 200 years ago, people said it would be impossible to land a rocket ship on the moon, but we've done it. Several hundred years ago, people might have said we would never find a cure for polio, but we have. And so that's proof, that's evidence that nothing is impossible. Well, it's not evidence of that. It is evidence of great achievement. There's no question about that. But it's not evidence of infinity. It's one thing to land a rocket ship on the moon. It's another thing to land a rocket ship on the sun. It's one thing to, I don't know, 200-300 years ago, people probably said, no one will ever beat the 4-minute mile record. And I can't remember the name of the man who did it. And so someone might say, well, see, there it's been done. That which was deemed to be impossible has been done. That's true. But does that mean that there's no limit to the amount, the speed in which a person can run? Does that mean it's limitless? Obviously, it doesn't mean that. Now, will someone someday break the 3.5-minute mile? I don't know. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that even if they do, that doesn't mean that there won't ultimately be a limit. Human beings are not infinite. Human beings have an end. Human beings eventually die. Physically, I'm talking about physically. No one escapes death. So we are finite. We have limitations. We begin our human life in weakness. We grow to a point of maximum strength, and then we continue to become weaker and weaker and weaker. That's the human condition. And obviously God can intervene and prevent that onset of weakness. But we're not talking about God right now. We're talking about humans. We're asking, are humans infinite? And the answer, of course, is not. We have limitations. Humans can only lift so much weight, ultimately. I don't care if a person can lift 500 pounds. They will eventually reach a point when they can't lift more. And we are not eternal. We have an end. We age and eventually die. We can be measured. We can be measured intellectually, and we can be measured physically. Now, you could call me a dream killer all you want, but the evidence proves these. The evidence bears these facts out. And now let's ask the question, is God finite or is God infinite? Well, the answer is clear. God is infinite. That's the essence of what it means to be God. Infinite. Without limitation. Unable to be measured. We can't put God under a microscope and examine him and measure him and evaluate him because he is infinite. There is no limits in God. God is only bound by his own nature and character. Period. The only thing that can possibly restrict God or limit God is his own nature and character, himself. No outside force can require of God or call God into account. Let me just read this passage from Isaiah 46. Remember this, fix it in mind, take it to heart. Remember the formal things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I make known the beginning from the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say, my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey. From a far-off land, a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that I will bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. Now, we humans can say that. We can boast. But eventually, the same person who makes those kind of statements is going to die, is going to become weak physically and mentally, and will eventually die. No amount of boasting is going to change that. And by the way, I believe very much in the gifts of the Spirit and the power of the Spirit, but we're talking about humans now. Now let's talk about what is the truth? What is the truth? The truth is that we humans have limitations. That's the truth. Now, what is humility then in relation to God? Humility then would say what is impossible with men is possible with God. In other words, is the recognition, the acknowledgement, and the acceptance of truth. Humility would say, I need everything, God needs nothing. God needs nothing. God doesn't need to be worshiped. He doesn't need to be praised. Praise is not for his sake, it's for my sake. Worship is not for God's sake. It's not to boast his ego. He's not suffering emotional for attention or praise. Praise and worship is for my sake. And so God is, humility would say, the Lord is my strength and shield. My strength, he is my enabler. Humility would say, I can do all things through Christ who enables me, or through who strengthens me. So humility would not say, I have nothing to offer. Humility would say, without God, I have nothing to offer, but with God, I can offer or accomplish anything that God calls me to accomplish. So let's think back about this statement. You can do anything you want to do if you're willing to work hard enough. What's the truth? What is the truth? The truth is, and what I would tell my children is, you can do anything that God calls you to do. That's the truth. There is not a power in this world or in hell that can prevent you from doing and being what God calls you to be and what God calls you to do, period. And to say that is not prideful, because it's giving the glory and the credit to God. Humility is recognizing a statement that's made in 2 Timothy, where Paul said, in a large house there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for noble purposes, and some for ignoble. If a man cleanses himself from the latter, that is, ignoble things, he will be an instrument for noble purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work. Now, the Pharaoh of Egypt was what the King James Bible would call a vessel of dishonor, or an instrument for ignoble purposes. Moses was a vessel of honor. Joshua was a vessel of honor. Esther, Mary were vessels of honor, instruments of God for noble purposes. Paul, Peter were vessels of honor. And point is that if we acknowledge God and put God first and have a fear of God and humble ourselves before God and acknowledge that we need Him, He can and will give us wisdom, and He will lead us into His purpose for our life. So in summary, if I'm talking to my children, young children, and I want to teach them, I want to guide them in a way that is wisdom, I would ask them, what do you want to do when you grow up? They might say, well, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a carpenter, a construction, and have my own business, or I want to be a school teacher, or whatever. The first thing I would say to them is, I suggest you talk to the Lord about this. Take your request, your desire to God. Make a decision that God is first, that it is first and is going to be first in your life. That you will acknowledge your need and your dependency for God and trust Him to direct your steps. Then I would say further, if you do that and you start acting on that, don't just think it and say it, but act on it. And trust that God will lead you into the field that He has in mind for you. A purpose for you, a purpose that will bring you a sense of fulfillment. You see, I firmly believe that joy is the will of God. I don't believe God wants people to be unhappy. That's nonsense. It seems to me that years ago, Christians had the idea, or some people had the idea that if you're a Christian, you had to be unhappy. You had to be suffering. You had to be not necessarily miserable, but certainly not fulfilled and happy. But that's not true. What parent would want their children to grow up unhappy, suffering, and miserable? What parent would want their child to spend a life working at something they find unfulfilling and unsatisfying and unrewarding? I firmly believe that God has a plan for every single individual who serves Him. And that this plan is a plan that will provide a sense of meaning and purpose in life and bring about joy in a person's life. So that's the way I would encourage my child or my children to go. So now let's talk some in terms of humility in relation to other people. And in order to do this, we have to define three other terms. We have to define dependent, independent, and interdependent. Now, a dependent relationship, an example of a dependent relationship would be a newborn baby. I don't know of any creature in all the entire universe. Now, obviously, I don't know about all the creatures, but I don't know of any creature that is more dependent and helpless at birth than a human. I've seen animals born and walk within minutes of birth. I've seen animals run in less than an hour of birth. Animals can reproduce. I don't know all the ages in which, but I know some animals can reproduce after a year and a half of age. Humans can't do that. Now, I know that baby birds are very helpless at birth. I realize that. But they're not helpless for the same length of time that a human's. Humans, generally speaking, can't even walk until they're approximately a year old. What can that be said of any other creature on this planet? Now, why is that? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us why that's true, but I have an opinion about that. I have a point of view, if you will, about that. Personally, I believe that that's the intention of God. And the reason it's God's intention is because we humans are capable of so much more than any other animal on this planet. We're capable of doing more good, and we are also capable of doing more harm than any other creature. Consequently, I believe that God, and again, this is my opinion, causes humans to be so helpless for so long to give parents the opportunity to gain control and authority over their children. If you find that hard to believe, think about a 200-pound, 6-foot-tall 2-year-old. Now that's not something that I would want. So God, I believe, God is giving us time to gain a positive, constructive, helpful control over our children before they're 200 pounds and 6 foot 2 inches tall, before they're capable of acting on every selfish desire they have. So again, that's an example of a dependent relationship. A baby cannot even feed themselves. Now, an independent relationship is a relationship in which a person would say, I don't need you at all. You have nothing to offer me. I don't need your help. I don't need your opinion. I don't need your advice. I don't need your support. I need nothing from you. That's an example of an independent relationship. Now, what's true of humans? Well, as I mentioned, there are times in our life when we are completely dependent. We start in dependency, we grow to strength. The older we get, the more we move back into dependency. If you don't believe that, visit some nursing homes and see if that's not true. Ask yourself if anyone has ever lived long enough that they have not gradually moved back toward dependency. Now, the truth is that overall, now I know there are periods of dependency, there are periods of independence, but overall, the nature of human relationships is interdependency. And what that means is we all have needs and we all have ability to meet one another's needs. And that's what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 12, where he says, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. He goes on to say we have different gifts according to the grace given to us. He uses in his letter to the Corinthian church the analogy of a human body. And our body is a perfect example of interdependency. Your eyes are not independent. Your eyes can't accomplish things without the aid of the rest of your body, without your brain. Your hands are not independent of your brain. So our body is an example of interdependent relationships. And And so what this Bible is telling us is that's nature. That's the purpose of God. He created us to be interdependent in our relationships. He created us in a way that we need one another, that we can help each other. And so humility then is a recognition that I am not independent, that I need other people. There are times when I absolutely need other people. And humility also recognizes that I also have something to contribute. That's what Paul meant when he said, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Well, how? Again, that refers us right back to the statement that the essence of humility is the recognition and acknowledgement and acceptance of truth. How should we think of ourselves? Well, we should think of ourselves in terms of the abilities that God has given us. No human being, I don't care who they are, is independent of God. It doesn't matter what we think or what we say, it simply isn't true. And so humility doesn't say I have nothing to offer, I have nothing to contribute. Humility says I have to contribute something that is worthwhile, something that has value, that was given to me and put in me by God. Humility says, if there is anything in me that is good, if there is anything in me that is noble, that is worthy of honor or praise, it's because God worked it in me. Because in myself, I am a fallen creature. That's what humility says. Now, let me give an overall view that I think will help us. What is true about people? Well, there are 4 statements. I need to find them. There are 4 statements that are brought out clearly in the Bible. And let me find them here in my notes. Let me summarize this way. The 4 things that are true, and this is an overview. This is not a detail. 4 things that are true. Number 1, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. That's a statement by David. I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You are made in the image of God. That's the first thing. The second thing that's true is that you either are now, or at least were, deeply fallen. Fallen, separated from God. Having lost godliness, having lost the ability to fulfill the purposes of God. Unrighteous, unlike God. You either were that or you are that now. Number 3, you are greatly loved. In spite of your fallenness, you're not loved a little bit, you are greatly loved. And number 4, in Christ, you are graciously redeemed. Now that's why I said earlier, you either were or are greatly fallen. In Christ, you are no longer fallen, you are redeemed. Redeemed means that you have been restored to fulfill the purpose that God has in mind for you. Now, let me summarize this way, referring back again to the idea of whether or not a person can accomplish anything they set their mind to do. I want you to imagine walking into a hospital, a children's hospital, say St. Jude Children's Hospital. And coming across a little girl or a little boy and asking them what kind of dreams you have, what you think about, what do you imagine. And that little child being born with birth defects that may prevent them from even being able to walk. And then saying to that child, and that child saying, well, you know, I watch TV and I watch basketball players, and my dream would be to play in the NBA. Now, would it be a kind thing or a cruel thing to say to that child, look, don't be lazy, just apply yourself and work, and if you work hard enough, you can do that? Would that be a kind thing to say or a cruel thing to say? Now, am I saying that that child can't do that? No, not at all. And that's the point. I don't know. And the person who says they can also honestly doesn't know. That's the point. What I would say to that child is, take that dream to the Lord. God can make it possible. God can heal you. God can enable you. That's what I would say. Now, another example, just a few weeks ago I was watching, and I wish I could remember the man's name, but his first name, I believe, is Nick. I can't remember his last name. But I watched him on TV share his testimony in a prison. Now, a thing that's unique about Nick is that he was born without arms or legs. And he has just enough legs, I guess, that he could move from one. He had been placed on a table so people could see him. And he could move from one end to the other on whatever legs he had. He had no arms whatsoever. He was born that way. Now, would it be a kind thing to say to him, Nick, don't be lazy. Don't be pessimistic. Apply yourself and make your mind up to work, and you can someday play in the NBA. Who would say that? Who in their right mind would say that to somebody? And yet we think it's clever or wise to stand up in front of a group of students who are graduating from high school or college and say, you can do anything you want if you're willing to work. It's not true. And it's a cruel thing to say that to people who have birth defects or have been injured to the point that they can't even walk. That's not kindness. It's cruelty. Now, it would also be cruel to say to a child, you can never be what you dream, or you can never be what you... That would also be cruel, to kill a child or a person's dreams. So what is the truth? The truth is, you can be whatever God calls you and equips you to do. That's the truth. And that is humility in relation to God. Humility in relation to other people is acknowledgement that I have needs that I cannot meet myself, and I depend on you to help me with that. I can't perform eye surgery on my own eyes. I can't remove cataracts from my eyes. I can't perform heart surgery on myself. I can't fix my car. Everything I know about fixing an automobile, I could write on one side of a 3x5 card. I need the help of other people. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I'm not ashamed to admit that. It's true. Now, does that mean when I admit that I need God, does that mean I'm a humble person? It doesn't mean that I'm humble in all respects. Of course not. It does mean that I have humbled myself before God. It does mean that I have humbled myself in relation to other people. It doesn't mean that I'm perfectly humble. But it does mean that I'm at least a work in progress. At least I'm moving in that direction. And so we need to get rid of this idea that humility means thinking that you're worthless or you have nothing to contribute. That's not true. So we need to find that truth between the idea that you can be anything you want to be and the lie that you can be anything you want to be, and the truth that you can be anything that God calls you to be. Well, I'm going to stop here. I could just keep talking, but I'm going to stop. And in our next session, our next episode, we will talk about wisdom and in wisdom and what? Wisdom and what? See, I've got this mental block here. Well, we'll talk about it when the time comes. Thanks for watching.